Hello, I'm Mark Fulton from markfulton.org. Thank you for tuning into this video about St. Paul. Who was St. Paul? Well, Paul was a Jew who was also a Roman citizen. He appeared on the scene 15 to 30 years after Jesus died, and he'd never ever met the living Jesus. He was a fellow who had a very active imagination. He used that to try and spread his version of religion into the Gentile world of the Roman Empire. He had grown up in Tarsus, a city on the banks of the Mediterranean. Now, Tarsus was a very thriving, cosmopolitan part of the Roman Empire. There were many religious cults there, and Paul received a good education. He could speak and read in Greek. He could also write in Greek. So he was a very different sort of Jew than the poor fundamentalist, xenophobic Jesus from the backwater of Galilee. So Paul used his imagination to invent theology. He invented the idea that Christ was a god, which was a very novel and quite a blasphemous idea for any Jew to entertain. Jews had for hundreds of years earlier believed in the existence of the one and only Yahweh who never had any family. Paul, like many other Jews, was quite morbidly obsessed with the concept of sin. He believed that sin offended Yahweh, and to appease Yahweh for sin, one had to perform a blood sacrifice. This was why thousands of animals were slaughtered annually in the grounds of the temple. Now, Paul had a rather odd idea. He needed to legitimize the crucifixion of Jesus. So he claimed that Jesus' crucifixion was a sacrifice to make up for the sinfulness of humanity. This rather odd idea was in some ways attractive to the simple first century Gentiles who were mainly uneducated people. They could now relate to a God who had come and lived amongst them and then given up his life for his mates. The real Jesus, who knew none of this and had no intention of dying, would have been totally perplexed with this idea. Paul then invented the story that Jesus rose from the dead. That was something that a lot of gods throughout the Roman Empire had thought to have done as well. And I think Paul was just mimicking them. He claimed Jesus, after he had risen, then returned up to heaven only to come back to earth, and he was going to get all believers, living and dead, and take them back up to heaven with him to live in heaven forever after. This fanciful idea became known as the second coming of Christ, and it never actually really happened. Paul was totally 100% wrong on this, and even modern fundamentalist Christians will admit this. Why did Paul make up these stories? Well, Paul was a salesman who, as I said, needed to expand his version of religion into the Gentile world. He knew that he couldn't sell traditional Judaism because it had too many unattractive features to it. He knew he had to change the rules, so he did. He got rid of the need for circumcision. He said people no longer needed to obey the Sabbath rules, so no one had to stop work on Saturdays anymore. He got rid of the dietary kosher rules. He ignored the idea that Jesus was a political Messiah of Israel and claimed that Jesus was in fact the spiritual Messiah of the whole of humanity's soul. He claimed Jesus was the Son of God who had died to save the whole world from its sins. He said God had raised Jesus from the dead, which proved that God accepted Jesus' sacrifice on man's behalf. He said all that was now required to get into heaven was to have faith in his manufactured story about Jesus. Voila! The Christ myth was born, and so was the very first version of Christianity. Paul claimed that if you didn't have faith in his story about Jesus, you were doomed, and he used that as a threat to scare anyone who wouldn't join his cult. And there's no doubt about it, Paul was a cult leader, and he was very power hungry. He simply invented the rules of the established religion because the old religion no longer suited him. It just happens that the cult he started turned out to be rather large. I don't like Paul. He was an ambitious, narcissistic man and quite deluded. He actually believed he was the walking embodiment of Jesus. He said some dreadful things about women, about sex, about homosexuals, about his fellow Jews, about government, and about slavery. Unfortunately, these awful prejudices have become part of Christianity. Jews everywhere universally despised him. He argued with the genuine disciples and family of Jesus, who, by the way, were not Christians. They were dyed-in-the-wool Jews. When Paul returned to Jerusalem on one occasion, James, the brother of Jesus, who was in charge of these Jews, sent Paul to the temple to get purified and prove he was still a true Jew. He was arrested there by the Romans, marched off to Rome, and he never regained his freedom. We have the amazingly ironic situation then of James, the very brother of Jesus, terminating the travelling career of the Christian heretic Paul. Paul didn't write about any of Jesus' teachings because he didn't know of them. The Gospels were yet to be written. Jesus, who had died roughly 20 years earlier, knew nothing of Paul's theology. Jesus was a Jew. He was never, ever a Christian. He was not the Son of God. He did not sacrifice himself so Gentile sinners could get into heaven. Jesus had no intention of dying. Jesus did not rise from the dead. He was just a young man who was very angry that Rome was exploiting his fellow Jews, and he tried to do something about it in the best way he could. He was spectacularly unsuccessful, and he paid the ultimate price. It is ironic that the Romans, the very people Jesus despised, adopted him as their hero god a few centuries after they killed him, and then blamed his own people, the Jews, for his death. This is big, big news. It means that Christianity is a belief system based on nothing more than the ramblings and prejudices of Paul. If a religion is based on superstitious nonsense, it can hardly have any genuine value. Why was Christianity born? Please have a look at my next video. Thank you for listening.